The wind howled across the plains like a restless spirit, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and smoke from distant campfires. The sun was just slipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the dusty hills and wooden fences of the small settlement. At the edge of the town, where the dirt road twisted toward the river, a solitary figure moved with quiet purpose. She was a widow, her shoulders wrapped in a worn shawl, her eyes steady but shadowed with memories of a life that had once been full of laughter and warmth. Her name was known only to the few who dared speak with her. But the townsfolk whispered stories about her, stories of loss, courage, and the kind of strength that did not seek attention but demanded respect. That evening, the widow's modest home, a cabin of rough-hewn timber and creaking floors, felt emptier than usual. She had spent the day tending the garden, repairing the fence, and listening to the wind as it carried whispers of the wild beyond her yard. The children in town had long since gone home, their laughter fading like a distant echo. She poured herself a cup of weak tea and sat by the fireplace, the orange glow reflecting in her tired eyes. It was in that quiet, almost sacred moment that she heard a faint sound outside, a soft whimper, barely more than a breath, but unmistakably human. At first, she thought it might be a stray dog, one of the many creatures that wandered the plains searching for scraps. But when she opened the door, the sight that met her was something else entirely. A girl, no older than 10 or 11, crouched in the dust, her small frame trembling with cold and fear. Her hair was dark and tangled, and her eyes large, wary, and filled with a quiet fire, looked at the widow with a mixture of desperation and defiance. She wore a thin dress, torn and dirty, and her bare feet were caked with the red earth. The widow's heart clenched. She had known loss, and she recognized it in the girl's posture, in the way she flinched at the smallest movement. Without thinking, she stepped forward, her hand outstretched. "It's all right," she said softly. "You're safe now." The girl hesitated, suspicion written in every line of her face, but hunger and exhaustion spoke louder than fear. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she allowed the widow to lift her into her arms. Inside the cabin, the fire warmed the girl's shivering body, and the widow brought her a blanket and a cup of milk. She had no idea who the girl was or where she had come from, but something deep inside her stirred a mixture of pity, protectiveness, and a strange sense of destiny. The girl did not speak, only watched with those piercing eyes, as if weighing the widow's every word, every movement. She seemed familiar in a way the widow could not explain, as if she carried a history that was intertwined with the land itself, with the stories whispered by the wind and the rustle of the trees. For nights afterward, the girl slept fitfully, haunted by dreams the widow could only imagine. When she finally did speak, her voice was quiet and guarded. "I don't have a home," she said. "I have no one." The widow nodded, understanding more than the girl could ever know. She had lost her husband to the unforgiving hand of the frontier, and in losing him, she had lost a part of herself. And now, perhaps fate had brought her this lost child to fill a void neither of them could yet name. She named the girl Willow, after the tree that bent without breaking in the wind, the tree that seemed to survive storms, no matter how fierce. Willow looked at her new name with cautious eyes, but when the widow smiled and tucked her under the blanket, she allowed herself to hope. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, Willow began to trust the widow. She learned to speak again, to laugh softly, and to help with chores around the cabin. The widow taught her to plant seeds, to fetch water, and to care for the small flock of chickens wandering in the yard. Each day Willow seemed more at home, but there was a shadow in her eyes that refused to fade, a shadow of the past, of things she could not yet remember, of a family torn apart by violence she had never spoken of. The townspeople watched with curiosity and suspicion. Some whispered that the widow had finally gone soft in her loneliness, taking in a wild child who might bring trouble. Others sensed something more, something hidden beneath Willow's quiet demeanor and the widow's protective gaze. They did not know, could not know. Willow carried a secret heavier than any burden they had ever seen, a secret that could change everything the widow thought she knew about safety, family, and the fragile peace of their small town. One evening, as the wind rose and the sky turned the color of bruised copper, a rider appeared on the distant hill. The silhouette of a man on horseback, broad-shouldered and deliberate in his movement. watched the cabin with an intensity that made the widow's stomach tighten. She did not recognize him, but the feel of his presence was like the brush of a cold shadow against her soul. Willow, who had been playing with a small wooden doll, froze and stared at the window, her lips pressed together. She did not speak, but the widow noticed the flicker of fear in her eyes, a fear that was not new, a fear she had not seen before. The rider did not approach immediately. He remained on the hill, silent and patient, as if testing something he could not name. The widow, her hands clenched on the edge of the table, felt a rising unease. She wanted to call out, to warn Willow, but she hesitated. Something in the way the girl sat there, stiff and alert, told her that Willow already knew. There were truths the girl carried in her blood, truths older than the widow's own memories, truths tied to a past she could neither see nor fully understand. Night fell, and with it came a stillness that pressed against the cabin like a weight. The widow lit the lantern and placed it on the windowsill, hoping to pierce the darkness to keep the unknown at bay. Willow sat quietly by the fire, staring into the flames as if they held answers she could not speak aloud. The widow reached for her hand, and for a moment their fingers touched, a fragile connection bridging the gap between safety and danger, past and future. The wind carried the sound of hooves again, closer now, and the shadow on the hill moved with purpose. Oh! The widow's heart raced. She did not yet know who the rider was, nor did she know the full story Willow carried inside her small, silent frame. But something in her bones whispered that the child she had taken and the girl she had named Willow was not an ordinary lost soul. She was the daughter of someone powerful, someone feared, someone whose name could make even the bravest men tremble. The widow could feel the tension coiling in the air, like the sharp bend of a bowstring ready to release. Willow turned her gaze toward the window, her dark eyes reflecting both fear and defiance. She did not speak, but the widow understood that whatever lay ahead, their lives had just shifted forever. The girl they had thought was lost had a story that would not stay buried, a story that would demand reckoning. And the rider, silent and imposing on the ridge, held the key to a past the widow could not yet grasp. As the night deepened, the wind whistled through the cracks in the cabin, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and danger. The widow tightened her shawl around her shoulders, her mind racing. She knew that the quiet days of planting, feeding chickens, and soft laughter were over. Something was coming, something that would test her courage and the fragile bond she had formed with Willow. And yet, in the shadow of uncertainty, she felt a strange, unspoken resolve of promise that she would protect this child, no matter the cost, even if it meant facing the most feared warrior the land had ever known. The cabin stood silent, the fire flickering as if holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. Outside, the wind carried a whisper of stories long buried, of bloodlines and vengeance, of survival and secrets, and in that hush, the widow and Willow sat together, bound by circumstance and the fragile thread of trust, unaware of the storm gathering on the horizon, a storm that would change their lives forever. The wind had not settled by morning, moved through the cabin like a restless animal, rattling shutters and tugging at loose boards. The widow rose before sunrise, her movements deliberate and quiet. She did not want to wake Willow, yet the girl was already sitting at the edge of the bed, her dark eyes watching the doorway as if she had sensed something in the night that the widow could not name. Willow's presence was both fragile and unyielding. She was small, but there was a tension in her body, a coiled readiness that spoke of years spent surviving alone. The widow remembered the first day she had found her in the dust, trembling and wary, and she realized that the girl carried not just fear, but a history she could not yet understand. Willow's silence was heavy with it, and even in these quiet moments she seemed to listen for things the widow could not hear, watch for shadows that the sunlight could not cast. The widow tried to coax her into breakfast, offering warm bread and fresh milk, but Willow only shook her head. She took the food without a word, her hands moving quickly, almost as if she feared the plate might vanish. The widow watched her, noting the small details, the way she flinched at sudden movements, the careful way she avoided the open spaces near the windows, and the strange way her eyes followed the horizon as if expecting someone to emerge from the hills. "Did you have a dream again?" the widow asked gently, pouring herself another cup of tea. Willow hesitated, then nodded slightly. She did not speak of the dream, but her small fingers traced the edge of the blanket as though drawing shapes only she could understand. The widow realized that Willow's mind held stories she was not ready to share, memories too sharp to voice aloud. And yet, there was a courage beneath the fear, a determination that drew the widow closer, binding them together in a way words could not. Outside, the town was stirring. Merchants opened their shops, children ran with laughter through the dusty streets, and the blacksmith's hammer rang against metal, echoing across the plains. But for the widow and Willow, the world felt smaller, narrower, focused on the cabin and the hills that surrounded it. The shadow on the ridge from the night before still lingered in the widow's thoughts, unshakable, like a warning carved into her mind. The widow decided to talk to one of the neighbors, a man who knew the land well and had lived through years of skirmishes and raids along the plains. He listened carefully as she described the girl, her features, and her behavior, nodding slowly. "Not like the children we usually see wandering through town," he said, voice low. "There's fire in her eyes, and not the kind you see in ordinary kids." Someone raised her with strength. "Either way, you'd do well to watch her closely." The widow thanked him and returned home, her thoughts restless. That evening, she took Willow to the river nearby, hoping the girl would feel some ease near the flowing water. Willow's eyes, always alert, softened slightly as the current murmured against the rocks. Yet she kept glancing toward the hills, scanning the distance with quiet intensity. "You're waiting for someone?" the widow said softly, not accusing, only stating what she saw. Willow did not answer at first. Then she whispered almost to herself, "He's out there, someone who watches. He knows me." The widow's heart skipped. She did not understand the full meaning of Willow's words, but she could feel the weight of truth pressing down like a storm cloud. That night, the widow tried to ask more, but Willow had retreated to the corner of the cabin, pulling the blanket close around her small frame. "It's not safe to talk about it yet," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. The widow sat beside her, holding her hand, feeling the tension of the girl's body, knowing that whatever secrets Willow carried, they were dangerous and old, older than the widow herself, older than any peace the town had known. The following days were marked by small discoveries. Willow learned to ride the mare that grazed near the cabin. Her movements careful but fluid, and she showed a strange skill with the bow and arrow, practicing silently in the clearing as if preparing for something she could not name. The widow watched her, both proud and wary, sensing that Willow's talents were not ordinary, that they hinted at a life far beyond the quiet routines of their small home. The town, meanwhile, began to murmur again. Children whispered about the strange girl at the widow's cabin, and adults exchanged knowing glances when they saw Willow moving with purpose across the yard. Some felt curiosity, others unease. The widow ignored the gossip, focusing instead on keeping the girl safe. But she could not shake the feeling that the shadow from the ridge had not left them, quietly in forms that were not always obvious. And she understood that Willow's skills, though impressive, could not protect her from every threat. The wind carried a new message one evening, faint and deliberate, like the tapping of a drum across the hills. Willow froze, alert and still, and the widow saw the change in her eyes, the recognition of something long expected. The past was closing in, and with it the presence of the man who had shaped Willow's early life, the man whose reputation had followed her like a shadow she could not escape. The widow felt a shiver run through her, realizing that their fragile peace was about to be broken, and that the stories whispered by the wind were only the beginning of what was to come. As night fell, the cabin was silent except for the crackling of the fire. Willow sat near the window, her dark eyes scanning the hills, and the widow remained close, aware that every sound carried a warning. Every movement could be the signal of an approaching threat. They were bound together by necessity, by trust, and by the unspoken understanding that their lives were intertwined with a past that refused to remain buried. The shadow on the ridge had not moved closer yet, but its presence was undeniable. It lingered in the air, in the tension of Willow's posture, in the widow's quickened heartbeat. The plains were quiet, deceptively quiet, holding their breath as if the land itself knew what was coming. And within the cabin, the widow and Willow waited, not knowing exactly when the storm would arrive, only that it was drawing nearer with every passing moment, ready to test them both in ways they could not yet imagine. The wind carried a sharper edge that night, cutting across the plains and rattling the shutters of the cabin as if warning the world itself that something had come alive. Willow sat at the window, her small frame tense, her fingers tracing the grooves in the wooden sill. Every shadow in the hills beyond seemed alive, stretching toward them, moving with intent. She did not speak. Her eyes alone told the story of fear, tempered by readiness. The widow watched her silently, the flickering fire casting light and shadow across both their faces, and she felt the weight of what was coming, pressed down like a storm she could not outrun. From the ridge, faint hoofbeats reached their ears, carried by the cold night air. Willow stiffened, barely breathing, and the widow's heart skipped a beat. The presence she had felt for so long, the shadow that had hung over them since the girl had first arrived, was moving closer. Every instinct told the widow that the man approaching was no ordinary traveler. He was deliberate, patient, and every movement carried the authority of someone who had known fear and commanded it in return. Willow whispered softly, almost to herself, "He's here. I can feel it." Every step, every shift of the ground, every change in the wind, he knows where I am. The widow did not ask who he was. She already understood. This was the man whose name inspired both reverence and terror, the father Willow had barely survived without. And now he was coming to reclaim his presence in her life, whether they were ready or not. The widow moved quietly, checking doors and windows, her hands steady, despite the storm of fear and anticipation inside her. Willow followed her lead, moving with a grace that was both instinctive and taught. They worked in silence, their shared understanding deepened by the danger pressing closer with every heartbeat. The wind carried the distant rhythm of hooves again, faster now, a pulse echoing across the plains. Willow's eyes darkened, and the widow realized that the girl's fear was not weakness. It was focus, a readiness to meet whatever was coming with courage she could not yet fully measure. They heard the first shouts before the rider appeared fully over the ridge. The man's voice carried across the plains, deep and commanding, calling Willow by a name she had not spoken aloud for years. She flinched, but did not hide. The widow tightened her grip on the edge of the table, realizing that the confrontation they had been anticipating was finally beginning. Every story, every warning, every instinct had led to this moment. Ah! The hills themselves seemed to hold their breath. Willow stepped forward, her small frame firm, her bow slung across her back, and her eyes locked on the approaching figure. The man on horseback slowed at the edge of the clearing, his face partially hidden in the shadow of the dusk. The widow could see the power in his posture, the quiet command that made the ground beneath them seem smaller. There was no aggression yet, only recognition and the inevitability of confrontation. Willow's past, hidden for so long, was colliding with their present, and the widow understood that what happened next could change everything. The man dismounted with deliberate care, his boots crunching against the dirt, and he moved closer with a slow, measured rhythm. Willow did not run, did not retreat. She stood her ground, her body coiled with readiness. The widow felt a chill of fear, knowing that despite Willow's skill and instinct, the man before them was a force unlike any they had faced. Yet even as the danger loomed, there was something else in Willow's ease of recognition. A longing, a piece of her past that had never fully left her. The air was tense, thick with anticipation. The widow moved closer to Willow, offering silent support, but she knew that this was Willow's confrontation to face. The man paused a few steps away, his eyes dark and unreadable, scanning the girl who had survived alone, who had grown stronger than anyone could have predicted. "You've done well to survive," he said, his voice deep, controlled, yet carrying an edge of emotion that the widow could not name. "But the world you've known is not the one you were born into." Willow's lips pressed into a firm line. "I know who I am," she said, her voice steady. "I know what I can do, and I know what I've survived." The man's eyes softened briefly, a flicker of recognition passing over his features before returning to the hard, measured gaze of a warrior who had walked the line between fear and respect for decades. The widow felt a shiver run through her. She had seen courage before, but this was different. It was forged in fire, loss, and survival, and it radiated from Willow in a way that made even the fearsome man pause. The wind carried the sound of movement from the hills. It was faint, but the widow could hear it, and she realized that the approaching storm was not only the man before them. Others were coming shadows among the hills, figures that had remained hidden, waiting for the right moment. Willow sensed them instantly, her body stiffening, her hand brushing the bow across her shoulder in preparation. The widow's pulse raced. Their quiet cabin life had been an illusion, and now the full scope of danger was pressing close from every direction. Willow and the man spoke again, their words carrying both tension and history. "You were not ready to meet me before," he said. "You've grown strong, but the world is not gentle. You must understand that strength alone does not protect you." Willow's response was measured. "I am ready for what comes. I survived everything before, and I will survive again. But I will not hide from what I am." The widow watched, amazed and fearful, as the girl stood her ground against the one person who had shaped the darkest parts of her past. The shadows from the hills moved closer, subtle and deliberate. The widow could feel their presence like a weight pressing against the cabin walls. She glanced at Willow, who had already read the danger, already prepared for what was coming. The wind carried the faint sound of hooves, the rustle of movement, the quiet creak of leather and straps as unseen figures approached. Every sense told them that the night would bring tests, decisions, and revelations that could not be postponed. Lightning flashed across the horizon, illuminating the hills for a brief instant. Willow's eyes tracked the movement of the shadows, calculating and precise. The widow noticed the girl's hand tighten around the bow, her body coiled like a spring ready to strike. The man who had arrived, the father, stepped closer again, and this time there was a shift in his stance. A recognition that this was not simply a reunion, not simply a claim of lineage. This was a test of courage, of skill, of the resilience that Willow had carried for years. The tension stretched, thick and unrelenting. Every movement, every sound, every shadow carried weight. The widow felt her heartbeat echo in her ears, knowing that any wrong step could unleash consequences they were not ready to face. And yet, amidst the fear, there was a strange anticipation. Something was about to happen, a turning point that would bring the past and present together in a way that could not be avoided. Willow spoke softly, almost a whisper, but loud enough for the man to hear. "I am not the child you left behind. I am who I became while you were gone. I will not be afraid of anyone who comes after me." The widow felt a swell of pride and fear in equal measure. She had seen the girl transform from a frightened, lost child into someone who carried fire and strength in equal measure. Yet she also knew that this confrontation was only the beginning. The man before them had not come to fight alone, and the full danger of the plains had yet to make itself known. The wind rose again, louder now, carrying with it the sound of distant hooves, whispers of movement across the hills, the subtle rustle of the underbrush, where more shadows waited. The man paused, scanning the horizon, his face dark and unreadable, before turning his gaze fully to Willow. There was recognition there, but also a quiet calculation, a measure of respect, tempered by the awareness of the danger pressing in from all directions. The widow felt the tension tighten in her chest, her hands gripping the edge of the table. The cabin was small, fragile, vulnerable. Outside, the plains seemed to stretch endlessly, but every step of the approaching figures narrowed the space of safety. Willow's eyes were locked on the father, her body poised, and the widow knew that the next moments would test them both. Forced decisions and actions that could not be undone. Lightning split the sky again, and for a heartbeat the hills were revealed in harsh, stark detail. Shadows moved, horses shifted, and the sense of inevitability pressed closer. Willow drew in a breath, steady, controlled, ready to face what had followed her for years. The man before her lifted a hand slightly, a signal, a question, an acknowledgement of the tension that had been building for so long. The widow felt her pulse pound in her ears, knowing that the storm, both literal and metaphorical, was about to descend fully upon them. And in that charged silence, the world seemed to hold its breath. The shadows on the hills, the figures moving closer, the wind, the distant sound of hooves and the firelight flickering across the cabin walls, all became part of a single, taut moment. Willow stood, poised and fearless, and the man before her, her father. The most feared warrior she had ever known, waited, equally ready. The widow remained close, silent but alert, understanding that everything they had known, everything they had survived, was leading to this instant. The tension hung thick in the night air, unbroken, unrelenting, a promise that the confrontation, the reckoning, and the answers they had been waiting for were just within reach. And yet, for all the preparation, the skill, and the courage, none of them could know exactly how the coming hours would unfold. The plains, the wind, and the shadows held secrets still. And the climax of their story was only moments away, teetering on the edge of revelation, danger, and the possibility of a future they had barely dared to imagine. The wind had softened by morning, carrying a lighter touch across the plains. The fire in the cabin flickered low, casting warm shadows that danced along the walls. And for the first time in many nights, the widow felt a fragile sense of calm settle over the room. Willow sat near the window, her bow resting across her lap, but her eyes were no longer tense or haunted. She watched the horizon, where the hills met the sky, and there was a quiet understanding in her gaze, a knowledge that the storm had passed at least for now. The man who had ridden onto their land was close by, sitting on the edge of the clearing, his posture relaxed but watchful. His face, once so commanding and unreadable, now softened when he looked at Willow. She returned his gaze steadily, no longer afraid, no longer shrinking from the presence of her father. The bond that had been fractured by time, by distance, and by fear began to mend silently, in the way only deep understanding and shared history can mend something that was once broken. The widow observed them, her heart swelling with relief and pride. She had taken in a lost child with no idea of the danger or the legacy she carried. And now, seeing Willow meet her father, not with terror but with courage, she felt the story that had begun in shadows and whispers reach its turning point. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic confrontations, only the quiet acknowledgement that the past and present had finally met. Willow had survived, had learned, had grown, and the man before her had come not to harm, but to reconnect, to protect what he had once thought lost. "Willow," the man said finally, his voice deep but gentle, "you've grown stronger than I imagined. I see now that the girl I left behind. She has become her own person, someone capable and wise, someone who can face the world without fear." Willow nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I am who I became while you were gone. I learned what it means to survive, but also what it means to care. I didn't forget you. But I am not the child you left behind." The widow felt a lump in her throat. She had seen children grow. She had seen loss and resilience. But witnessing this reunion, the careful, measured meeting of fear and understanding, was something else entirely. She realized then that Willow's courage was not just in her survival, but in her willingness to face the man who had shaped her early years, to meet her past with clarity and strength. The plains, once full of shadows and unseen dangers, now seemed wider, softer, more welcoming in the light of understanding. Over the next days, the rhythm of life returned to the cabin. Willow helped tend the garden, feed the chickens, and care for the small homestead, all the while learning from her father. He was not a man of many words, but the lessons he shared carried the weight of experience. Wisdom born of the harsh world beyond the town. Willow listened, absorbing knowledge not out of fear, but out of respect and recognition. She practiced with the bow, learned to read the land, and slowly the shadows of the past lifted, replaced by a sense of security and belonging she had never known before. The widow watched them both, a quiet satisfaction filling her. She had taken in a lost child, unsure of what she was doing, unsure of the legacy she was inheriting. But now, she saw that love, care, and protection had done more than fill a home. They had restored a family, torn apart by time and circumstance. The townsfolk noticed the change as well. Whispers of fear faded into murmurs of admiration, of stories about the girl who had survived alone and now stood with courage, and the man whose presence had once inspired terror, now tempered by quiet pride. Willow's nights were peaceful at last. She slept without fear, dreaming not of shadows and hunters, but of open skies and safe havens. She no longer woke in the middle of the night, and the quiet sighs she had once given in her sleep turned into laughter and whispered words of comfort with the widow and her father. The cabin, which had been a refuge from danger, had now become a home filled with trust, learning, and new beginnings. One afternoon, as the sun bathed the plains in gold, Willow and her father rode out together to check the trails in the distant hills. The widow followed at a slower pace, carrying tools and supplies, watching them move with a harmony born of patience and regained trust. The wind was gentle, carrying with it the smell of sage and earth, a far cry from the tension that had once pressed against the walls of their small home. It was a moment of quiet triumph, though not one of grand celebration, simply a confirmation that the storm had passed and that the bonds of family, once lost, had been restored. Conversations between Willow and her father became easier over time. They spoke of the past without anger, of the lessons learned in solitude, of the strength that had been born from survival. The widow observed, often quietly, sometimes joining in, and saw how the girl had become a bridge between the wild, untamed world of the plains and the gentle, patient world of home and hearth. The once feared warrior softened in the presence of the girl he had once protected but never truly known, and Willow grew into her power not through fear, but through understanding and connection. The community began to notice changes too. The whispers of fear dissipated, replaced by admiration for the widow who had taken in a lost child. For Willow, who had faced danger with unmatched courage, and for the man whose reputation had once spread terror but now inspired respect in a new light. Slowly, trust and warmth returned to the town, the old American frontier feeling a little smaller, a little safer, because the story of Willow and the widow had proven that courage, love, and care could heal wounds long thought permanent. The widow found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them here. She remembered the first night she had found Willow, shivering and alone in the dust, and she realized that what had begun as an act of compassion had grown into something far larger. She had taken in a lost child, not knowing the legacy she carried, and in doing so, she had witnessed the strength of a new generation. The power of love and trust to restore bonds, and the resilience of a child who had faced the world with nothing but instinct and courage. Willow spent her days between learning from her father and helping the widow. She practiced with the bow, tended the garden, and explored the surrounding plains, always aware of her surroundings, yet never again consumed by fear. She had inherited her father's strength, but she had also found patience, understanding, and a sense of belonging that made her formidable in ways beyond mere skill. The widow watched, silently proud, knowing that the girl had found both family and herself in the process. The man who had once inspired terror now stood beside the widow as a partner in care, guiding Willow without demanding obedience, protecting without threatening, and teaching without judgment. Their home became a place of quiet learning, of shared stories, of laughter, and of safety. And slowly, the plains themselves seemed less hostile, the wind less menacing, and the shadows no longer seemed to stretch with threat but with possibility. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills and painted the sky with colors of gold and crimson, Willow sat beside the fire with her father and the widow. They spoke softly, reflecting on the past, the choices they had made, and the bond that had been forged in adversity. The widow felt a peace she had not known in years. She realized that her act of compassion had done more than shelter a child, it had restored a family, healed old wounds, and created a new future filled with hope and connection. Willow looked at her father and then at the widow, her eyes steady and bright. "I am not the same girl I was when you left me," she said to him, "but I am exactly who I needed to be. I am not afraid anymore." Her father's eyes softened, and he nodded, understanding at last that the child he had feared he lost had become a bridge between his past and the life he hoped to reclaim. The widow reached for Willow's hand, holding it gently, a gesture that spoke of love, trust, and the warmth of a family finally whole. The night stretched peacefully over the cabin and the plains beyond. The wind carried the faint scent of sage and earth, the quiet rhythm of life resuming its natural pace. Shadows moved in the hills, but they held no threat. Only the promise of space, of freedom, of the open world that Willow and her family could now embrace. The widow, Willow, and the man who had once been a distant figure of fear sat together in the glow of the fire, a family bound not just by blood, but by the courage, trust, and compassion that had carried them through danger, uncertainty, and loss. And so, the story ended not with conflict or fear, but with understanding, connection, and hope. Willow had found her place in the world. Her father had regained his role in her life. And the widow had discovered that an act of kindness could shape destiny in ways she could never have imagined. The plains, once wild and threatening, now carried the warmth of a home, a refuge, and a story that would be told with reverence for years to come, a story of courage, love, and the power of trust to heal even the deepest wounds. The cabin stood quietly under the stars, its walls holding the echoes of the past and the promise of tomorrow. Willow lay asleep with a peaceful expression, the widow beside her, and the father watching over them both. The wind whispered softly, no longer a harbinger of fear, but a gentle reminder that life had been restored, that the bonds of family could endure, and that even in the wildest corners of the world, hope and love could find a way to grow. And in that quiet, glowing moment, the widow understood something she had known in her heart all along, that sometimes the most unexpected acts of compassion could change everything. That the courage of a child could inspire the bravery of adults, and that a family, no matter how broken or lost, could always find its way back to one another. One night, a storm rolled in from the west, dark clouds blotting out the stars. Lightning split the sky, and thunder rattled the cabin. Willow sat by the window, her face pressed to the glass, her eyes following the flashes that illuminated the distant hills. The widow approached her quietly. "Tell me what you see," she said gently. Willow turned to her, expression tense. "He's coming," she said simply. "He's always coming, even when he's far away. I can feel him, like the wind before a strike." The widow understood, in that instant, that Willow's past was not just a story of loss and survival. It was a story tied to power, to fear, and to a man whose reputation had spread across the plains like wildfire. Willow did not speak his name, but the widow knew it would be enough to make even the hardiest settlers uneasy. She felt a cold resolve settle in her chest. This child was under her care now, and she would protect her, even if it meant confronting forces she could barely imagine. Days turned into weeks, and Willow began to share fragments of her past. She spoke of a home in the mountains, of nights spent under the open sky with a man who was strong and feared, a man who taught her to move quietly and listen to the world around her. She spoke of others, of whispers in the campfires and lessons in the shadows, but never fully revealed the truth about her father. The widow sensed that these stories were only part of the whole, glimpses of a life that had been cut short, yet they were enough to make her realize the depth of the danger looming over them. The wind remained constant, carrying sounds from far away, the cries of wolves, the faint echo of horse hooves, and occasionally the distant whistle of a rifle shot. Willow listened, always alert, while the widow tried to maintain a sense of calm, keeping their routines steady and their days full of work. She planted more vegetables, tended the chickens, and mended what little clothing they had, all the while keeping her eyes on the horizon, waiting for the shadows she could feel but had not yet seen. One evening, as the sun sank low, a stranger appeared at the edge of town. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with a confidence that spoke of skill and authority. He asked questions about the widow and the girl, speaking carefully, yet there was an intensity in his gaze that made the widow's heart tighten. She did not recognize him, but something about him stirred a memory she had tried to ignore, a memory of warnings, of stories told in hushed tones about a warrior who commanded respect and fear in equal measure. Willow watched the man from the window, her expression unreadable. The widow saw the subtle shift in her posture, the tightening of her fists, and the slight flare of her nostrils. She did not yet speak of what she knew, and the widow did not press. Both understood that the story had layers they could not yet uncover, a history that demanded patience and caution. That night, the widow lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She thought about the past, about loss and survival, about the strange twists of fate that had brought Willow into her life. She felt the weight of responsibility pressing down. Knowing that the girl in her care carried more than just memories, she carried a legacy. A bloodline that could either protect them or destroy them, I think. And outside, the wind whispered through the hills, carrying a promise of coming storms, of challenges yet unseen, and of truths that would not remain hidden for long. Willow stirred in her sleep, murmuring words the widow could not understand. And in the dark, she felt the pulse of tension that ran through the child's veins. The widow tightened the blanket around her shoulders, sensing that their quiet life was only a prelude. The past was never truly gone. It waited in the hills, in the shadows, and in the eyes of those who had the power to change everything in an instant. And so, the days passed, each one stretching longer under the weight of anticipation. The widow and Willow moved through their routines, tending the land, caring for the animals, and sharing quiet moments by the fire. Yet beneath it all, a current of fear and wonder flowed between them. They were bound by circumstance, by trust, and by the unspoken knowledge that a storm was coming, a storm that would not respect the safety of their home or the fragile bond they had formed. The shadow remained on the ridge unseen, but felt like a heartbeat echoing through the plains. Willow sensed it as surely as she sensed the wind shifting before a thunderclap. The widow sensed it too, though she could not name it, only feel its presence pressing against the edges of her mind. And somewhere, in the distance, the story of the most feared warrior in the land waited to intersect with theirs, a story that had been set in motion long before Willow had been found, long before the widow had opened her heart, and long before the plains had grown quiet enough to invite danger once more. The night closed around the cabin, dark and still, yet charged with expectation. And in that quiet, the widow and Willow sat together by the fire, unaware of how close the past had come, and how swiftly it would reach for them. The wind had shifted again, carrying a chill that made the widow pull her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The hills beyond the cabin were dark shapes against the deepening twilight, and the widow could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, pressing against her chest. Willow sat near the fire, her small hands tracing the worn edges of her wooden doll, but her eyes never left the window. She flinched at every sound, the creak of the cabin, the rustle of the wind through the trees, even the distant call of a coyote. The widow knew she was listening for something the rest of the world could not hear. The rider from the ridge had not come closer yet, but his presence seemed to stretch across the plains, reaching into the cabin like a shadow that could not be ignored. Willow's movements were careful, precise, almost rehearsed, as if she had been trained for situations just like this. The widow had begun to notice small things, the way Willow kept the knives she found sharpened, how she studied the horizon for the faintest change, and how she seemed to know which paths through the hills were safe and which were not. The girl carried knowledge she had not been given in the town. It was a knowledge born of survival, of danger, and of a life that had been shaped by forces far beyond ordinary understanding. One morning, while the widow was tending the garden, she noticed Willow standing at the edge of the clearing, staring toward the distant hills. The girl's expression was unreadable, but her posture was tense, like a coiled spring. "He's coming," Willow said quietly, almost as if speaking aloud would summon him faster. "I can feel him riding across the plains. I've seen him before, and I know the way he moves. Nothing escapes him." The widow's heart clenched. She did not yet know the full measure of Willow's fear or the truth of the man she spoke of, but she understood instinctively that it was more than ordinary danger. The townsfolk began to notice the changes as well. There were rumors about the strange girl in the widow's cabin, whispers that she was not just a lost child, but something more, something connected to the fear that had always lingered beyond the hills. One merchant, a grizzled man with lines etched deep into his face, warned the widow cautiously. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he said. "There are people out there who don't forget, and there are bloodlines that carry more than memories. Be careful, or it'll be more than whispers that follow you." The widow nodded, keeping her concern close to her chest. She did not tell him that she already knew Willow's past was dangerous. She had seen the fire in the girl's eyes, and she had felt the shadow pressing toward them. Inside the cabin, the tension grew in small, quiet ways. Willow's nights were restless, and sometimes she woke screaming, murmuring names the widow had never heard. During the day, she practiced with the bow, shooting arrows into the far edge of the clearing, with a precision that left the widow breathless. It was as if the girl's past had prepared her for something that the widow could not yet imagine. And sometimes, in the still moments when Willow thought no one was watching, her gaze would turn toward the horizon, filled with a mixture of fear and recognition, as if she were expecting someone to appear at any moment. The widow began to hear stories of a man moving through the region, a warrior whose name was carried on the wind, spoken in fear and respect. They said he had fought battles that left towns trembling, that he could track a person across hundreds of miles without faltering. They said he was relentless, a shadow of the mountains themselves. Willow did not need to hear these stories. She had grown up with them, had lived with them, and had felt the weight of that man's reputation pressed into her every step. She did not speak much about him, but the widow began to understand that the girl was not just lost. She was hunted, or at least connected to someone who had the power to strike fear into everyone around. The days grew longer with anticipation. Willow became restless, pacing the cabin, checking doors and windows, testing the paths that led into the hills. The widow tried to keep the routine, to maintain some sense of normalcy, but it was a fragile illusion. One afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Willow suddenly paused mid-step, ears straining toward the distance. "He's closer," she whispered, her eyes dark and alert. "I can hear the rhythm of his horse. He knows I'm here, and he's coming to find me." The widow felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She had taken Willow in out of compassion, out of a desire to heal a wound she recognized in the child's eyes, but now she realized that compassion came with a price. The girl's past was not a story she could set aside. It was a force moving toward them, inevitable and unstoppable. Every shadow along the ridge, every movement of the wind, every distant sound seemed to carry a message that danger was closer than they had imagined. Willow's skills became more pronounced under the growing tension. She hunted small game with astonishing accuracy, prepared food with care, and even fashioned small traps around the cabin, as if anticipating an attack. The widow watched silently, learning to trust the girl's instincts, even when she did not understand them. She realized that Willow's fear was coupled with a resilience that made her formidable, that whatever threat lay beyond the hills could not underestimate the child she had brought into her home. But danger was not the only presence shaping their days. The widow herself struggled with memories of loss and survival, and she began to see echoes of her own past in Willow's eyes. She had known grief, and she had learned to endure it. But the girl's presence reminded her of the fragility of life and the cost of taking in someone who carried so much history. She found herself questioning whether she had the strength to protect Willow from the storm that was surely coming, a storm that was already gathering beyond the horizon. One evening, a neighbor approached the widow quietly, his voice low and serious. "There's talk in town," he said, "about a rider moving through the plains. People are uneasy, and some are even afraid to leave their homes after dark. They say it's a man who doesn't forgive, who doesn't forget. They say he's looking for someone." The widow nodded, her eyes narrowing. She did not reveal what she already suspected, that Willow was the reason for the fear, that the girl carried a connection to a man whose reputation alone could strike terror across the region. Willow spent that night awake, listening to the wind and counting the faint rhythms of the plains, her small hands clenched. The widow tried to speak with her, to soothe her fears, but Willow only shook her head. "It's coming," she said. "It's not just a shadow. He will be here, and I have to be ready." The widow held her close, feeling the girl's heartbeat against her own, sensing that they were both waiting for something inevitable, something that would change everything. The tension extended beyond the cabin as well. The townsfolk began to notice unusual activity in the hills' faint trails of horses, disturbed wildlife, signs that someone was moving with purpose. Rumors grew, and whispers traveled faster than the wind. Some said it was bandits, others swore it was a ghost, a specter of the old conflicts that had scarred the land. But the widow and Willow knew the truth was closer, far more immediate and far more dangerous. Willow's past, though largely hidden, began to unfold in fragments. She spoke occasionally of nights spent under the stars with a man whose presence was commanding, a man whose name carried weight in every campfire story. She described lessons in tracking, in silence, in strength and patience, though she never fully revealed his identity. The widow pieced together what she could, understanding that the child in her care was linked to a warrior whose reputation was legendary, a man whose return would not be gentle or forgiving. Meanwhile, the widow also struggled with the practicalities of protecting Willow. She reinforced the cabin, sharpened tools, and kept a careful watch on the surrounding hills. By every rustle of leaves, every distant hoofbeat, every shadow in the corner of the clearing made her heart race. She had learned the hard way that danger could come,